Hi everyone, this is DM Yeknom from House Rule Gamers back once again. This time we're going to take a look at the standard player character races offered in AD&D 2nd edition. Again, this is from the PDF of the premium edition of the 2nd edition Player's Handbook, which can be purchased from drivethrurpg.com. So let's go ahead and start by discussing what we're talking about for ability scores for the races. For humans, the minimum is a 3 and the maximum is an 18. Sans any kind of magical, devices being involved to increase or lower that. This isn't necessarily the same for the demi-human races. The non-humans gain modifiers to their ability scores. This is due to their physical size or their natural grace or their inherent constitution or their native sense of zen. And you can see that there's minimums that actually have to be attained before you could qualify for such a race. Dwarves, they're naturally stout and healthy. So surely you'd have to have a minimum strength and a minimum constitution. Simultaneously, because they're so wide and stout, they're probably not the most graceful individuals, and their gruff natures and general social demeanors make them not the greatest of leaders or of spokespeople. So therefore, they're not going to be as dexterous or as charismatic as others may be. Elves, elves have a certain level of intelligence, a certain level of charisma, a certain level of grace, and a minimum level of health that must be achieved in order to be one of these individuals that are known as elves. They carry themselves with a sense of grace and a sense of purpose that really isn't found much else or anywhere else in the other races, to be honest with you. Gnomes, Gnomes are kind of like dwarves in the fact that they're stout, not quite as large. They're healthy. They also tend to be somewhat more intelligent than their counterparts. They do a lot of diligent studying, and they have a natural affinity for learning. This means that gnomes have minimums in strength, constitution, and intelligence. Half elves, which are partially elves and partially humans, they've got the same maximums that humans do, but their elven heritage grants them a slightly, greater sense of grace, of intelligence, and a slightly greater constitution, than their normal human counterparts may have. Halflings, of course, they've got to be a certain level of stoutness to carry around the foodstuffs that they carry and to live in the homes that they live in. And they have to be a certain level of health, and they have to have a certain level of intelligence and be a certain level of graceful in order to just survive in the societies that they create. But at the same time, they're not quite large enough to be truly massively strong individuals. So they have modifiers that, of course, will come and go based off of that. All of the non-humans speak their native tongues, and they speak a version of the common language, the trade language, if you will. Let's move on a little bit to talk some more specifically about dwarves in particular. So dwarves have their ancient enmity between goblins and giants, racial eons of working with stone that have given them sort of an understanding of stonework that few individuals could match. They have a slightly different light spectrum that they can view, giving them extravision. They understand how warfare against giant folk work. Their inherent constitution and resistance to magic grants them a bonus to resist poisons and magics, whilst at the same time causing certain types of magic to not function properly for them, especially those magics that are not intended for the vocation that the dwarf has taken up. Elves, our next topic, are somewhat different. Yes, they have a different light spectrum than humans that they can see, but they also have a natural affinity for stealth and surprise, and they spend decades in their formative years learning the use of the long and short sword and bow. They also have very keen eyes that spot details in hidden walls and doors that most other races miss. Gnomes, very much like their distant cousins, the dwarves, have a natural affinity for stonework that's passed from generation to generation, and so much that even the least obedient gnomish youngster knows how to find his way underground. They learn the ways of war against giant creatures and have some kind of inherent resistance to poisons and magic similar to what dwarves have. They've also had century upon century upon century of war waged against them from goblin kind, And this has created an understanding of the way that such creatures battle, granting gnomes bonuses in battle against those creatures. Half elves, well, they're kind of stuck between two worlds. They have much of the same traits that humans have, and some of the traits that elves have. They share the elven spectrum of visible light, and some of the elves' ability with secret doors and hidden passages. They also share a lot more of the human single-mindedness for their choice of vocations and their advancement in such vocations. Halflings have a resistance to poison and magic that is due more to their appetites and luck than anything else. Their size and cunning allow them to gain an advantage against giants and the like in battle. Their childhoods are spent skipping rocks and hurling stones with slings, and thus they learn the use of the sling quite well. Their small size grants them an ability with stealth that rivals that of the elves. Non-humans. All non-humans have level limits. This may seem contradictory at first, but this is really due to the short lifespan of humans. Humans are able to intensely focus on one aspect of their life as they do not have time nor the natural calling to the other endeavors that are born into the demihumans. Dwarves are called to the forge, they're called to the gym, they're called to the craft. It's a calling that they hear from the moment they are born, and adventuring can only interrupt that for so long. Elves are called to a spiritual realm beyond the known worlds, and they can only hold off preparing for that world for so long. Once they succumb to the call, their adventuring is over, and they begin the centuries-long journey to reach the realms beyond. Gnomes and their noses sniff out the way of the future for their kin. Their calling is inherent, and adventuring can only stave off their need to enhance their community for so long. Their skills, their humor, their one-of-a-kind practical jokes need to be passed on to the younger generations, and eventually they give up their adventurous ways. Half-elves are caught between two worlds here. The long-lived elves who long for a paradise beyond this one, and the short-lived exuberant humans who push for all they can achieve in their short lives. This allows half-elves to fill certain roles better than others, particularly bardic roles, as bards travel to and fro and tell tales of the long ago and of the now and what of the will be. Halflings, all three of the types of halflings, are really homebodies at heart. They want the sense of hearth, they want the warmth of family, the joy of community, and their wanderlust only lasts for so long, at the end of which they return home to tell the tales of their great adventures, never return to such daring things, but only to widen the eyes of the youngsters listening to them spin their tales. Demi-humans have the time in their youth to learn more than one vocation, and often learn several. This allows for them to multi-class. But just as with singular classes, their nature calls them to their people long before they reach the supreme levels of these classes. Humans, with their single-mindedness, most likely end up focusing on just one vocation, though some who are exceptional abandon their previous vocation, their starting vocation, and gain a new one. And this is known as dual classing. Height and weight and age are also something that have to be considered for the races. The range should be kept with what is shown on the table, as this is the average for most campaign worlds. This is not to say that a player and a DM cannot go beyond those limits listed, but weapons and beasts of burden and clothing and armor and the like would be harder to adjust for the extremes of height and weight. Age is a relevant factor as time passes in a game just as it does in the real world. Actually, game time passes much faster. And as races age and people become older and venerable, age really is creeping upon everyone. And those who were once young and full of vim and vigor, they start to slow down. Yes, wisdom and intelligence may go up, but physical strength and physical health tend to decline as things age. The starting age ranges show the typical amount of time that such a race would spend in learning their initial vocations. This has been GM Yeknom for House Rules Gaming. Keep watching for our next part in this series about the AD&D 2nd Edition Player's Handbook.